Today's story put me in mind of that old Zen riddle. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? Well, the Hixon rail crash might be as near as you can get to that scenario happening in real life. When a speeding passenger train unexpectedly met a heavy haulage lorry crossing the line, a lorry that was carrying a gigantic 120-ton electric transformer. The 1960s were a period of tremendous upheaval for the British rail network. Long gone were the pioneering days of Victorian ingenuity and the construction of incredible viaducts and bridges. By the 1960s, it was all about saving money and transitioning to private car ownership. This need to streamline the sprawling network was seized upon with an almost fanatical zeal by the man in charge of British Rail, Dr. Richard Beeching. His reports resulted in the destruction of around 30% of the entire rail network. That's 7,500 miles of track, 2,500 stations, and the loss of almost 68,000 jobs. This seemingly wanton destruction of one of the world's oldest and most comprehensive rail networks has been described as the single greatest act of infrastructural vandalism ever carried out by a government against its own country. However, even before the Beeching cuts took their toll, there had already been cost-cutting measures put in place, and one example of this was the removal of manned railway crossings. Now, back in the day, each and every level crossing was manned, that is to say that a railway employee would come out of his hut to manually close the gates and then reopen them once the train had passed. This was, of course, time-consuming and expensive, as someone had to be paid to do that job. The answer was to switch to automatic crossings, similar to those that were already in use in parts of the European continent. This changeover to automatic crossings began in the early 1960s, and the barriers on the West Coast Main Line just outside the small Staffordshire town of Hixon were installed in July 1967. One overlooked or underplayed aspect of the change to automatic crossings was that it put the responsibility for safety squarely on the shoulders of the individual motorist, not on the railways. Now, I know it's not rocket science realising that you should stop when the red lights flash and the barriers come down, but the general public's unfamiliarity with these new crossings, combined with the confusing signage, the brief warning time, and the sometimes erratic behaviour of the barriers themselves, were all factors in making the use of these crossings much more hazardous than it should have been. The job in question for the Winds haulage firm that day, which was Saturday the 6th of January 1968, was to transport a huge 120-ton transformer from the English Electric factory in the centre of Stafford to their storage depot, which was a leased hangar at the disused RAF Hixon airfield. Due to the size and mass of this transformer, Winds would need to use a double tractor unit. This behemoth of a vehicle consisted of a 32-wheel, 16-axle low loader in the centre and two powerful steering tractor units at each end. The entire vehicle was 148 feet in length and weighed, with the transformer in the middle, a whopping 162 tons. Now that's an incredible amount of mass that's going to be trundling along the streets of Staffordshire that morning. As the crow flies, RAF Hixon was only around 5 miles from the factory, but the size of the load necessitated a long, tortuous route which crossed the railway line just before reaching the depot. The massive transporter, accompanied by police escort, left the factory at 9:30 a.m. The front tractor unit was being driven by the experienced Mr. Groves, and the rear tractor unit was being driven by Mr. Ilsley. There were also 3 assistants walking alongside to warn of any snags along the predetermined route. Obviously, it was slow going, and it took just under 3 hours to arrive at the now automated level crossing just outside of Hixon. As the convoy approached the crossing, they would have seen the new 2 hammers sign and the headroom clearance sign warning of high voltage cables above. One of the police cars crossed over first to make sure that the entrance to the field was unobstructed. Then the policeman gave the clear signal and indicated for the heavy hauler to begin crossing the railway track. Now, crossing the line was no easy feat, but it could be done. The problem was the overhead power lines, which limited the clearance to just 16 feet 6 inches. The transporter, with the transformer loaded on it, topped out at 16 foot 9 inches, but the adjustable hydraulic suspension meant that the driver could lower the clearance down to 16 feet 3 inches, just enough to get through. However, going that low would almost certainly ground out the trailer on the railway lines, so it was going to be one of those threading the needle type jobs. A very slow crossing coupled with intense concentration from the drivers. An inch too low and they'll be scraping the railway track. An inch too high and they'd be finding out what happened when you touch a high voltage power line with a metal vehicle. At 12:26 p.m, the transporter began inching its way across the line, both drivers concentrating intently on the upper and lower clearances, carefully manoeuvring the enormous load across the tracks. Just as the front tractor had cleared the lines and the transformer was straddled across both tracks, the red warning lights of the crossing began to flash, the warning bell rang, and the barriers came down. A train was coming, and it was going to hit the crossing in just 24 seconds. The train, BRE 3009, the Manchester Piccadilly to Euston Express, was a 16-car passenger train carrying around 300 passengers. It was on time and making good progress as it rounded the bend and the Hixon crossing came into view. Train driver Stanley Turner, seeing the crossing completely blocked by the huge transformer, immediately slammed on the brakes, but it was no use. Travelling at an estimated 85 miles an hour, the train needed almost a mile to stop, and there was barely a quarter of that distance remaining between the train and the crossing. The Wind's drivers, Groves and Ilsley, yelled for everyone around the crossing to get clear, and they both hit the accelerators hard. A very brave decision for the rear driver, Mr. Ilsley, as the most likely result of this action would be his tractor unit being right on the lines as the train hit. However, a 162-ton heavy hauler isn't exactly quick off the blocks, and the transformer had barely cleared the northbound track when the train hit. Ilsley remembered seeing train driver Stanley Turner through the cab window, gripping his controls rigidly and staring ahead in horror. The impact was utterly catastrophic. The locomotive hit the low loader on the left corner, flinging the 120-ton transformer to one side and ripping the trailer in two. The cab of the locomotive engine was completely flattened, and its front wheels were sheared off and rammed back underneath the heavy engines. The first 5 passenger coaches were almost completely destroyed, spilling and tumbling into a twisted mass of metal and broken glass, debris scattered over a wide area of track. 3 carriages behind these also derailed, but thankfully remained upright. Such was the force of the impact that the railway tracks were completely torn up as far as 125 yards from the point of impact. One of the policemen in the transport convoy was able to use his car radio to contact staff at HQ, an action which alerted the authorities very quickly to the accident, enabling doctors and army medics to rapidly reach the scene by helicopter. At the same time, realising that the immediate danger was if another train was coming, the train guard, a Mr. W. Final, 49-year-old man described as not being in the best physical condition, ran 1.5 miles up the track to place red warning flags, then all the way back, past the wreckage, stumbling through muddy ploughed fields, to run 1.5 miles down the track to place similar warning flags on the other side of the accident. His quick thinking was noted in the inquiry. Looking at the photographs, it's easy to imagine a death toll well over 100 for an accident like this, but amazingly there were only 11 fatalities. The driver and 2 others in the train cab, and 8 passengers. The main reason for this is that the first-class coaches were located at the front of the train and, due to the ridiculously high cost of travelling first class on British Rail, they were almost completely empty. The rear of the train, where the second-class passengers were, escaped the brunt of the crash. These carriages were packed, with people standing in the aisles and by the doors. Now, I know it's of scant consolation for the people who did perish in this accident, but in all honesty, this rail crash could have been a lot worse. The public inquiry into the Hixon disaster was chaired by Barrister Edward Gibbons, and his findings highlighted shortcomings with almost everyone involved and the operations of the automatic barriers themselves, which were at the time being busily installed across the country at large. The haulage company, Wins, came in for especially harsh criticism from Gibbons, as it turned out that another of their low loaders had been involved in a near miss just a year earlier. In that incident, the road surface on the far side of the crossing had not been fully repaired, and there was a 4-inch drop which caused the tractor unit to ground the low loader and block the lines. A railwayman from the adjacent signal box apparently told the driver, "You can't park there," seemingly happy to berate the stranded driver instead of using his time to warn the approaching train that there was a vehicle stuck on the tracks. As the lights flashed and the barriers dropped, the driver gunned the engine, slipped the clutch, and actually wheelied the heavy tractor unit, dragging the low loader off the tracks by sheer force just as the train sped past. After this near miss, Wins had written to British Rail, complaining that for heavy slow-moving vehicles, or for example a stalled car, 24 seconds was not enough time between the lights flashing and the train arriving at the crossing. The response from British Rail was to brush off these concerns completely, blithely saying that this was a road user's problem, not theirs, an action described in the inquiry as being remarkable for its arrogance and lack of insight. However, Gibbons also blamed the Wins drivers, saying that after the earlier near miss they should have known better the dangers of taking a slow-moving vehicle over a crossing. In their defence, the drivers stated that the police escort had been the ones clearing each intersection and declaring it safe to pass, and for them, the rail crossing was no different. The policemen admitted that they themselves had never seen one of these new crossings before and were completely caught off guard by the short warning time, one stating that he was absolutely astounded by the speed of the whole process. In the end, no one person was found to be at fault, but rather a whole raft of minor failings combined with the unfamiliarity of the new automated barriers ultimately caused the Hixon crash. In the wake of the tragedy, new post-Hixon signs were put up, leaflets distributed, and a public safety campaign was launched to educate the general public about the safe way to use these new level crossings. This couldn't come soon enough, as even as the Gibbons inquiry was collating its findings, 5 more people were killed in an accident when another passenger express hit a small car which had stalled and had been trapped between the barriers as they came down. Although there have been other deadlier rail crashes over the years, the Hixon tragedy is not completely forgotten. A small memorial to the victims of the crash was unveiled at the nearby church on January 6, 2018, the 50th anniversary of the tragedy. Sometimes when I'm researching a topic for the Raven's Eye, you find a story where it seems that everything that could possibly go wrong does indeed go wrong, resulting in just about the worst possible outcome. Every contributing factor seems to have either occurred in just exactly the wrong place or right at the worst possible moment. Today's story is one of those. I can clearly remember this accident when it occurred, as back in 2001 I was still in the north of England and this happened not too far from where I was living at the time. In the early hours of the morning of February the 28th, 2001, 37-year-old builder Gary Hart was driving his Land Rover Defender westbound along the M62 motorway, towing a loaded car transport trailer behind him. After just 6 in the morning, as Hart was approaching junction 34 south of Selby, the Land Rover and trailer left the carriageway, crashing through a flimsy wooden fence and bouncing down a grassy railway embankment before coming to rest on the track below. Gary Hart, shaken but unhurt, tried in vain to reverse the Land Rover off the railway track, but as it became apparent that this was impossible, he exited the vehicle, dialling 999 for the emergency services on his mobile phone. Having got through to the operator, Hart shakily began to describe what had happened, but before he was able to do much other than describe the situation he found himself in, he heard the sound of an approaching train. The early morning Intercity 225 service from Newcastle, bound for London's King's Cross, had ploughed into Hart's Land Rover, completely ripping away the front part of the vehicle. Travelling at around 90 miles an hour, the train, consisting of a front and rear trailing engine with 9 passenger cars, had seemingly gone through the Land Rover as if it wasn't even there, remaining upright and on the track and continuing on southwards with no apparent damage. However, although the train had remained upright and on the track, its front 2 wheels had been derailed. A small detail maybe, but one which was to have deadly consequences in the following seconds. Brakes screeching but moving under its own inertia, the still speeding express carried on down the southbound track, passing a set of points which gave access to a goods siding. The front 2 wheels, which were already derailed, were bumped up and over by the points, causing the Intercity 225 to jump the track over onto the northbound line, where, you guessed it, there was another train coming. The northbound train was a Freightliner goods train carrying some 1,800 tonnes of coal, bound for the nearby power station at Ferrybridge. This train was travelling at around 55 miles an hour. The combined speeds of the 2 trains moving in opposite directions resulted in a head-on collision of around 140 miles an hour, and the devastation was immediate and terrible. The forward engine car of the Intercity 225 was almost completely destroyed as it went under the freight locomotive. Behind, the first passenger coaches rode up into the air as the effect of the impact went through the still-moving train. The crash had unfortunately occurred directly underneath a road bridge, leading to increased damage to the passenger train, especially the first 3 carriages, some of which had their roofs sheared off as they collided with and tore along the underside of the bridge. By the time the Intercity 225 came to a halt, all 9 passenger cars had come off the rails, most of them jackknifing across the track or spilling over into the adjacent field. The force of the impact was so great that one carriage was thrown over 430 feet from the track. The freight train fared little better. The initial impact tore off the wheels of the engine as it rode up and over the Intercity cab, coal wagons spilled off to the side of the track, and the engine derailed completely, crushing an empty caravan that was parked alongside the railway line and crashing to a halt just a few feet from the nearest house. Emergency services were quickly on scene, but working in the twisted and torn wreckage was awkward to say the least. Helicopters were brought in to ferry the wounded to nearby hospitals, as many of these victims needed urgent medical assistance. The final tally: both drivers, 2 staff members and 6 first-class passengers were killed. 10 people dead and over 80 injured, many of them seriously. Looking at the wreckage, it's easy to imagine that the human cost could have been much, much greater. But fortunately the early hour meant that the train was nowhere near its full passenger capacity. That, however, is just about the only positive factor in this tale. The rest of the story seems to have aligned like some sort of terrible synchronicity of bad luck. For example, Hart's Land Rover left the motorway in just exactly the worst possible location. Any earlier, he would have stopped before the railway line, and just a few feet further on, he would have hit the crash barriers and stayed on the motorway. Along the entire route of his journey, his car left the road at that exact spot, the one single place where he could have ended up on the railway line. Then the Intercity 225 arrived almost immediately afterwards, giving no time to get the car off the track. The set of points that was located just down the track, with no other points for miles in either direction, but of course it was these points which provided the nudge the train needed to jump the track. And of course, to cap it all off, there was an oncoming northbound freight train right at the precise moment that the Intercity left the track, and they collided under a bridge, maximising the damage to the passenger train. If any of these factors had been absent, it's possible that the damage and the casualties could have been much reduced. So, the one thing I haven't talked about, the elephant in the room: why did Gary Hart's Land Rover come off the M62 motorway in the first place? Well, initially Hart told investigators that he thought he hit something on the road, which caused some kind of steering problem, and he lost control of the car. The media reports of the time portrayed Hart in a sympathetic light. Wasn't he also a victim, an innocent man who would have to live with this unavoidable tragic accident for the rest of his life? After all, this could have happened to anyone, right? Well, not quite. As more details began to emerge over the following weeks, the public perception of Gary Hart began to shift radically. As the investigation into the rail crash deepened, it turned out that Hart hadn't suffered any kind of mechanical failure at all. He'd actually fallen asleep at the wheel, after having been up all night without any sleep. Hart described himself as having an unusual lifestyle, stating that he loved to live life at 1,000 miles an hour, and that on the morning of the accident he was buzzing, having spent all night chatting on the phone to a woman he'd met on an internet dating site. Being in the middle of a divorce from his wife, chatting to strangers on the internet all night and seemingly showing little remorse for what had happened did little to help Hart's public image. North Yorkshire police began putting together Gary Hart's movements prior to the accident. He'd been on the phone from 9:45 the previous evening until about 3:45 am, and was in the Land Rover and driving away by around 4:30 am. Hart told police that this wasn't unusual for him, and that he often went 36 hours or so without sleep, but that it wasn't a problem, he could handle it. He denied falling asleep at the wheel, but other motorists confirmed that they had seen Hart's Land Rover weaving around on the motorway in the early hours of February the 28th. Expert witnesses testified that Hart wouldn't have just fallen asleep with no warning, he would have been dozing on and off and would have had plenty of warning that it was time to pull over and stop driving. To get to the scene of the accident by 6:13 am from Hart's house, police stated that Hart must have been driving, quote, like a bat out of hell. Hart's bragging about his ability to survive on just coffee for days at a stretch, and that how he was high on life and a modern-day hunter-gatherer did little to dispel the police's suspicions that Hart was unfit to drive that morning. Hart was charged with dangerous driving, and after a much publicised trial, was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Police described him as a mobile catastrophe waiting to happen, and that his reckless driving at high speed whilst he was dozing off was undoubtedly the ultimate cause of the Selby rail crash. Hart was released from prison after just 30 months. Relatives and campaigners were outraged that Hart was freed early, but this is seemingly standard practice in the British justice system, where convicted criminals often only serve half their sentence. Now, you might think that Hart would have preferred to slip quietly into anonymity, but his hour in the media spotlight seemed to have left a mark, and on the 10th anniversary of the crash, Hart gave an interview to a local radio station, whereupon he stated the following. "I believe in fate, and I was meant to be there that morning. The accident occurred because I was there, the same for the people that were on the train. They were meant to be there that morning. As far as being asleep at the wheel, that's what I went to prison for. It's not what the truth is. No deaths occurred at the point of impact with my Land Rover. They all occurred 700 yards down the track, which I feel other people should have been held accountable for. So, in my own head, I've dealt with it. I've absolved myself, not of responsibility, but of knowing anything about the victims. That would degenerate my life into misery. I survived this accident, and I want to survive the rest of my life." Unsurprisingly, Hart's comments did not go down well with the families of the victims, nor with some of the wounded survivors who are still living with the life-changing injuries to this day. After all, for many of those involved in the Selby rail crash, forgiving yourself and deciding to move on with your life just simply isn't a viable option. Seemingly forgotten by history, the Ufa rail disaster is one of the world's deadliest peacetime rail accidents. On June the 4th, 1989, more than 500 people lost their lives and over 800 were seriously injured when two packed tourist trains were caught in a huge explosion just outside of Asha, a small town in the southern central area of the Soviet Union. The accident happened on the same day that Chinese troops stormed the student protest in Tiananmen Square, and with the attention of the world's media focused on Beijing, the Ufa rail disaster was barely mentioned in the news, and has remained a forgotten tragedy ever since. The accident occurred on a stretch of the Kuybyshev railway line between the towns of Ufa and Asha, near the southern end of the Ural Mountains in the region of Chelyabinsk. Due to poor maintenance practices, a liquefied gas pipeline which ran parallel to the railway lines had sprung a leak. Engineers in the closest monitoring station had noticed the fall in pressure, but instead of investigating the cause of the pressure drop, they had simply increased the flow through the pipe to push the pressure back up to normal. As the leak had occurred in a remote, sparsely populated area, nobody had been bothered to follow up on the pressure drop, and so the leak had not been fixed. The few people who had been in the area and who had complained of the smell of gas were ignored by the authorities. The butane gas, which was heavier than air, had been accumulating in the low valley for weeks. Unusually mild and windless weather had allowed the gas to form a huge cloud, with the railway tracks running right through the middle of it. This stretch of railway was mainly used by trains making the journey from the Siberian city of Novosibirsk to the Black Sea resort of Adler. A 3-day journey, it was nonetheless very popular, and at this time of year the trains coming and going were packed with young families, soldiers on leave, and many young teenagers heading for the Soviet Pioneers Youth Camp on the Crimean coast. In the early hours of the morning of June 4th, 1989, 2 passenger trains travelling in opposite directions entered the low-lying area where the gas had accumulated. The packed trains were carrying an estimated 1,300 passengers between them. The actual source of ignition is unknown, but it's thought that a spark from one of the train wheels ignited the gas, causing the whole cloud to instantaneously combust. The ensuing explosion was enormous. The fireball was seen over 100 kilometres away, and the force of the blast flattened trees for 3 kilometres around. The force of the blast has been estimated to be at around 10 kilotons of TNT, and by comparison, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima was estimated to have a yield of about 12 kilotons. Of the 37 rail coaches, 7 were destroyed so completely that they were reduced to fragments. The rest were torn, twisted, and thrown around like toys. The blast also set everything around on fire, eventually burning a ground area of over 250 hectares. Survivors of the blast were not only wounded and disorientated, they were in immediate danger of being burned alive in the wreckage or caught in the now raging forest fire which surrounded the site of the explosion. The first responders came from the central gas substation. They did not know what they were heading towards. The reports were vague, they had no information about what to expect, and they just had to follow the glow of the fire in the darkness to find the site of the explosion. Many assumed it was just a pipeline rupture, and they had no idea of the carnage that awaited them. Tamara Strieger was a nurse and an anaesthetist on the ER team and one of the first to arrive on scene. We arrived there as 2 ER brigades, a resuscitation and a cardiological one. The first thing we saw on site was 3 children, 3 teenagers. They were walking towards us like bats, their arms outstretched with flaps of skin hanging down from them. Upon arriving at the site of the wreckage, it became clear to the responders what had happened and the scale of the tragedy that they were facing. Bodies were lying everywhere in and around the site of the wreckage. Survivors, many of them children, were screaming in pain, and terribly burned passengers were stumbling around in shock. Many had run into the forest to escape the flames, and it took rescuers hours to find them. Of those who initially survived, many were so badly burned that their chances of survival were slim. The nurse Tamara Striga recalled one soldier called Donstov who had been caught in the blast but had valiantly remained in the burning coach, helping as many people as he could escape through the broken windows. He had 85% of his body burned. He was doomed. When the explosion occurred, he fell off the top bunk and, as he said, he had only his watch left on him. The power of the blaze burnt everything instantly. That's how high the temperature was. He only asked to let his wife know that he wanted her to marry another man at some time. He did not want his little child to live without a father. He knew he wasn't going to make it. Over the next 12 hours, the survivors were transported to any and all available hospitals. Many went straight to the hospital in Ufa, the nearest city, whilst others were flown to Moscow for specialist treatment. The Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev visited the scene of the accident, and he described it as a real hell on earth. Soviet troops were brought in to clear the wreckage and the bodies. Many of the soldiers were visibly distressed at the scene. Many bodies were burned beyond recognition, and removing these must have been a very grim task indeed. Dr. Svetlana Mazgutova, a volunteer worker who specialised in helping traumatised survivors, was flown to the hospital in Ufa. Even years later, she was able to vividly recall the scene. Everyone seemed filled with madness. Children ranging from 2 to 19 years of age were screaming, crying, shouting in hysteria, or running about frantically because of their pain and the difficulty in breathing. Over the next days, 1 out of every 6 children died in our arms. Official numbers vary. It's estimated that over 300 passengers died at the scene, with a further 275 deaths confirmed in hospital. The official figures are 575 killed, with over 800 injured, many seriously. However, as young children were not always counted on train manifests and overcrowding on trains was common, it's generally believed that the actual death toll was closer to 780. In the aftermath, several employees of the pipeline company were charged, although the sentences were light, the maximum sentences available being only 5 years in prison. A memorial stands today close to the site of the accident, and an annual memorial service is held there. But to this day, despite the huge death toll, this tragedy remains mostly forgotten. If you were to ask someone, even in Russia, about the Ufa train disaster, most people would simply have no idea what you were talking about. The date was February the 28th, 1975, and it was a normal, typical, busy Friday morning on the Tube, the vast underground train network which serves the City of London and its suburbs. But this was a Friday morning which would be remembered in London's history as a dark day. At just before 9 in the morning, a packed underground train ran a red light and crashed full speed into a dead end. 43 people were killed and 74 injured in one of Britain's worst rail disasters, and to this day, mystery surrounds the cause of this tragedy. The London Underground, affectionately known by locals and visitors to the city as the Tube, is the world's oldest underground railway, first opened in 1863. Made up of 250 miles of track and 272 stations, it transports almost 1 billion passengers a year. Its iconic trains, stations and signage are well known worldwide, selling millions of dollars worth of memorabilia and often featuring in movies and TV shows. It's also very safe. On that fateful Friday, back in 1975, the Tube had been running for over 100 years with only one major accident, the Stamford crash, and that had occurred over 20 years earlier. Most passengers that morning were simply concerned about getting to work on time or thinking about plans for the weekend. The last thing on anyone's mind that morning was safety concerns. By all accounts, the day began like any other. The driver of the train, 56-year-old Leslie Newson, arrived for work around 6:10 in the morning, which gave enough time for a cup of tea and a chat with colleagues before starting his shift at 6:25. There seemed to be nothing amiss with Newson. He shared a joke with a colleague about making sure to leave some sugar for a cuppa after he finished his shift, and he mentioned he was going out to look for a second-hand car that afternoon. He had £300 in his wallet and was wanting to buy the car for his daughter. Although his work colleagues didn't know Newson particularly well, they respected him as a conscientious and careful driver. He was maybe a bit of a stickler for the rules, and certainly not a wild or impetuous man. After finishing the usual preliminary checks on the train, making sure the brakes were working and all the systems were operating normally, Newson began his shift, running the train on its short return route between Drayton Park and Moorgate. This was routine stuff for Newson. In the previous 2 weeks, he'd been in and out of Moorgate station over 120 times. At just after 7 a.m, the guard, 18-year-old Bob Harris, joined the train. He rode up front with Newson for a bit as the train shuttled back and forth between the stations. Harris told Newson that he was off camping that night, but Newson joked that he must be mad. He said that for him it was way too cold and that at his age he was more of a hotel man. Harris then took up his position in the guard compartment as the train continued to shuttle the Friday morning commuters between the stations. By the fourth return trip to Moorgate, Harris was getting a bit bored, and he left his post to see if there was a discarded newspaper somewhere on the train. Having found one, he sat down in the carriage to read, not returning to his cabin where the emergency brake was located. Engrossed in that morning's paper, he didn't notice that the train wasn't slowing down as it approached Moorgate. There was no through track here. Moorgate Platform 9 was literally the end of the line. A short overrun tunnel extended past the platform, ending in buffers, and a 5-foot thick concrete wall. About 30 passengers who were waiting on the platform watched in disbelief as the train entered the station at full speed. They caught a glimpse of the driver, sitting straight up, looking straight ahead, seemingly making no effort to stop or slow down the train as it roared past the platform. Ignoring the red warning light, the train ploughed straight into the overrun tunnel, smashing through the buffers and slamming into the dead end of the tunnel wall. There was no warning. Surviving passengers said that there wasn't even time to cry out. Travelling at an estimated 40 miles per hour, the results were horrific. Upon entering the dead-end tunnel, the train, which in reality was now just so many tons of speeding metal, wood and glass, simply had nowhere to go. The front carriage hit the hydraulic buffers and flew up into the roof and the tunnel wall. Immediately it was bent and crushed as the rest of the train carried on into the tunnel. It hit with such force that the front cab and first row of seats was crushed down into a space of just 60 centimetres. The second carriage went ploughing into the back of the first, driving up the rear end and mangling it horribly. The front of the second carriage was driven down, squashed underneath the first, becoming just a mass of compacted, twisted metal, broken glass and splintered wood. The third carriage rode up into the roof of the tunnel as the train finally came to a halt. A huge black cloud of dust and soot blew back out of the tunnel, choking everyone in the station. The lights went out, and in the darkness, the screaming started. Within minutes, rescue services were on scene, but what confronted them was a worst-case scenario the likes of which nobody there had dealt with before. It was pitch black. There was barely any room to gain access to the trapped survivors. Choking dust was everywhere. The carriages in the tunnel were a twisted mess of metal. About the only thing in favour of the rescuers was that at least the wreck hadn't set on fire. Journalist Gerald Kemp described it as a horrible, horrible mess of limbs and mangled iron. A doctor from nearby St Bart's Hospital recalled his first impressions upon arriving on scene. The front carriage was an indescribable tangle of twisted metal, and in it the living and the dead were heaped together, intertwined among themselves and the wreckage. It was impossible to estimate the number involved, because the lighting was poor, the victims were all tangled together, and everything was covered with a thick layer of black dust. Many of the victims were writhing in agony and were screaming for attention. The rescue effort was further complicated by the fact that they were operating 21 metres underground, and that all supplies and any wounded survivors had to be ferried up and down the many steps. The radios wouldn't work so deep underground, and so messages had to be relayed by runners. In the limited space, firemen were restricted to rudimentary tools such as hacksaws and crowbars to cut into the mangled carriages. As rescuers began to work, the temperature soared. A thermometer in the tunnel recorded 49 degrees Celsius. That's 120 degrees Fahrenheit. With no available ventilation, it was like working inside an oven. The thick layer of fine dust and soot was easily disturbed, choking the rescuers and the trapped victims alike. Nonetheless, the firemen worked tirelessly to free the wounded and trapped, often having to be ordered out of the tunnel to take a break. Such was their determination to free as many people as they could. And they had to do all this by working by only the light of old-fashioned box lanterns. Incredibly, by midday the fire crews had managed to remove all but 5 of the trapped survivors. These 5 were the most difficult survivors to get to, and some needed amputations before they could be cut free from the wreckage. In the end, it would be another 10 hours before the last survivor was cut free. Calling out and listening for any reply, but hearing only silence in the tunnel, the fire crews knew that it was now just a case of removing wreckage and bodies. It took 4 days to clear the tunnel and to reach the body of the final victim, the driver, Leslie Newson. A total of 43 people were dead, and there were a further 74 people hospitalised with injuries. The pressing question was what had gone so tragically wrong, but the inquiry into the Moorgate disaster was to leave more questions than answers. There seemed to be 2 obvious potential causes of the Moorgate crash. First, that the braking system on the train was defective, or secondly, that the crash was intentional and that the driver committed suicide. The train in question was made up of 1938 rolling stock and was almost 40 years old. These were the workhorses of the London Underground at the time, with hundreds of these units running daily without problems. They may have been old, but these things were built to last. A thorough inspection of the braking system revealed no defects. Indeed, it seemed that the brakes had not been applied at all during the final moments before the crash. The driver had kept his hand pressed down on the dead man's handle, keeping the train moving under power. Eyewitnesses remembered the driver sitting calmly at his post as the train shot past the platform. That did not sound like the countenance of a man who was struggling to stop a speeding train with defective brakes. So attention turned to the driver, Leslie Newson, as suicide now seemed the most likely explanation. However, there seemed to be little in his personal life that indicated a man ready to take his own life. He was by all accounts a quiet and conscientious man with a happy family life. He liked his job, and he wasn't in any financial difficulty. He didn't drink, and he didn't do drugs. His actions on the day don't seem to fit with a man who is planning to kill himself and take as many people with him as he could. He had the money in his wallet to buy a car for his daughter that afternoon, and he joked about having his cuppa when he finished his shift. Also, if he really was intending to kill himself, there's absolutely no way he could have known that the guard, Bob Harris, would be occupied reading his paper in the rear carriage. For all Newson knew, Harris was in his cab and would have pulled the emergency brake, preventing the crash from ever happening. A post-mortem on Newson's body supported the eyewitness testimony. Newson stayed upright in his seat, hand pushed down on the train's dead man's handle right up until the moment of impact. His injuries showed that he didn't raise his hands to protect himself, which would have been a natural reaction in the circumstances. Traces of alcohol were found in his bloodstream, but the coroner acknowledged that this could have been due to bacteria fermenting in his body during the 4 days that it was inside the hot tunnel. So the inquiry was left with the following scenario. A train with no defects was purposely driven straight into the dead-end wall by a quiet family man who wasn't suicidal. It just didn't make any sense. With no other option, the inquiry returned a verdict of accidental death on Hixon and the other 42 victims. Almost 50 years on, the Moorgate disaster continues to frustrate anyone who is looking for a definitive answer as to the root cause of what happened that day. Doing the research for this video, I came across people who firmly believe that the inquiry was just a cover-up by London Underground to avoid litigation. Others were convinced that Hixon was suicidal, but that nobody really saw the signs. And others think that he suffered some sort of fit, or was just simply daydreaming, and then remained frozen in place as the train hit. Journalist Lawrence Marks, whose father died in the crash, spent months poring over the inquiry findings, talking to coroners, psychiatrists, even Hixon's grieving family, trying to find a reason as to why Hixon drove that train into the wall. He found no satisfactory answer. The tragedy is remembered today for the selflessness and determination of the rescue services, who worked tirelessly in appalling conditions to save as many people as possible. 3 of the rescuers, Margaret Haig, Chris Wood and Richard Furlong, received medals for gallantry in the Queen's Honours List. Changes to the safety systems in place on the tube included the installation of automatic braking systems, known as Moorgate protectors, to all stations with terminal lines. Today, the victims are remembered in a memorial located next to Moorgate in Finsbury Park, and a plaque on the station wall which was unveiled in 2014. The Moorgate disaster remains the single greatest peacetime loss of life on the London Underground, and it's unlikely that we will ever discover the real reason behind it. Commuters all over the world have a lousy time of it, there's no doubt about that. Back in the day when I too was a 9 to 5 commuter, I had a journey that added 3 hours onto my workday every single day, and I hated every minute of it. I've often thought about how some of the victims of these disasters which I talk about on the channel sometimes must have spent their last hours alive doing something utterly mundane and tedious, like commuting or queuing up to get through an airport. Today's story is a story of just that. The poor commuters on the 609 Mount Victoria rail service spent their last hours getting up before the crack of dawn in order to spend time sitting on a cramped and dirty train, completely unaware of the terrible tragedy which would shortly unfold as their train rounded the curve towards Granville railway station. The date was the 18th of January 1977, a hot midsummer's day in Sydney, Australia. For some, the summer holidays were already underway, but for many others it was business as usual. For these people, it was another regular working day, and for a few it started with a long hot commute to downtown Sydney, boarding the 609 rail commuter service, which originated some 120 kilometres to the west in the picturesque village suburb of Mount Victoria. Now, a 2.5-hour train ride through the western provinces of Sydney on a warm summer's morning certainly sounds a lot nicer than most of our daily commutes would probably be, but even the passengers on this train were not immune from the toil of the daily grind. You see, by the mid-1970s, the New South Wales rail service was hardly the envy of the world. The rail infrastructure was run down and underfunded, and management struggled to keep commuters happy with constant delays and poorly maintained, old and dirty trains. Commuters on the service from Mount Victoria often complained about the state of their train, with some even bringing on board their own cleaning products to wipe down any surface that they would touch or sit on. The carriages were wooden coach-built ones from the 1950s, old-fashioned, quaint, but uncomfortable, and the engine pulling these 8 carriages was usually an older diesel type of engine. The commuter service from Mount Victoria was given priority scheduling though, as it passed through several distant suburbs, and dispatchers were advised to shuffle trains around to try and make sure that the Mount Victoria service stayed on time, as just a 3-minute delay could end up being a 30-minute delay if a slower train got in front of it. And part of the efforts involved in prioritising the arrival of the 609 included the raising of the speed limit along a right-hand curve that led into Granville station. However, this stretch of track, even with its higher speed limit, wasn't immune from the curse of poor management and absent maintenance. Granville station is located just 10 kilometres west of downtown Sydney and serves as an interchange for several main lines running in from the south and the west. On the approach to the station from Mount Victoria, the track made a long curve which passed underneath the Bold Street Bridge. Bold Street Bridge was a pretty unremarkable bridge as bridges go. It was just a nondescript functional road overpass which ran above the railway line. I haven't even been able to find any pictures of the original bridge as it stood in 1977, as it was so completely ordinary it seems that no one ever felt the need to take a photograph of it. However, it's worth noting a couple of things that came into play on that fateful January day. First off, the original Bold Street Bridge was supported from the underneath by stanchions, load-bearing pillars which took the weight of the roadway as it passed ahead. And the second thing to note is that the roadway of the Bold Street Bridge was unusually heavy. Apparently, when construction of the original bridge was nearing completion, it was noticed that the bridge was too low to join up with the roads on each side. Somehow, that ended up being about a metre off. Seeing as the bridge span wasn't very wide and it was supported from below by stanchions, the decision was taken to add concrete to make up this missing height. This resulted in the roadway surface of Bold Street Bridge being 3 times heavier than originally envisaged, clocking in at a whopping 570 metric tons. I suppose the engineers figured everything would be fine as long as those supporting stanchions were always there to hold the bridge up. It must have never occurred to them that in a worst case scenario these supports could be removed, for instance if a packed commuter train were to run into them. And so, on January the 18th, 1977, as the 609 service approached Granville station at 8:10 in the morning, all those years of chronic underfunding and poor track maintenance reached a critical point. Packed with 490 passengers and travelling at around 75 kilometres an hour, as the 609 rounded the curve just before the Bold Street Bridge, driver Ted Ollenswitz heard a loud crack and felt the left wheel come off the track. He threw the emergency brake, but it was already too late. Instead of following the curve, the train jumped the tracks and ploughed on straight ahead. The heavy locomotive smashed into the northern support column of the Bold Street Bridge, tearing away most of the bridge stanchions before ploughing on up the track, ripping through a metal pylon as it went. The top half of this metal pylon, still supported by the power lines, was left hanging in midair like some sort of giant jagged blade, and this blade tore into the first passenger car which had been dragged behind the engine. The ragged metal girder split the roof and side of the passenger car wide open like a can opener ripping through a tin of sardines. 8 passengers were killed instantly and dozens more were injured in this car. Now, the passengers in car 2 were the lucky ones as it missed the hanging metal girder and instead ran into the retaining wall of the cutting, having passed safely under Bold Street Bridge. There were obviously some injuries, but most passengers in car 2 were left unscathed. The rest of the train, passenger cars 3 to 8, had become uncoupled from the front part of the train, and they'd remained more or less upright on the tracks. These cars rolled to a halt to the front part underneath Bold Street Bridge. It looked like they'd dodged a bullet. There must have been a few moments of confusion and panic as the passengers struggled to understand what had happened to the rest of the train, but as the dust settled, panic and confusion gave way to a sense of relief that they'd seemingly emerged from this accident without a scratch. However, as the passengers began to gather their belongings and climb down from the train, the weakened Bold Street overpass collapsed, and 570 tons of steel and concrete crashed down onto the flimsy wooden passenger cars below. The damage and the destruction was instantaneous. The rear half of carriage 3 and the front of carriage 4 were crushed almost flat to the ground. Most passengers seated in these areas were killed instantly, as the train carriages were crushed down to as little as 20 centimetres in height. Motorbike commuter Alan Moore was riding across the Bold Street Bridge when it went down. It snapped in the middle and the two sides went down in a big V shape. It made a lot of noise. The brick ramparts in the side of the road were crumbling, and large chunks of masonry were rolling around in front of me. I saw that there was a train sticking out of either side of the bridge. People were starting to get off the train. I was in a mild state of shock, and it didn't occur to me that there would be people on the train under the bridge. But there were indeed people still alive, trapped on that train, and for them, their problems were only just beginning. For the rescue crews, nothing about this accident was easy. Initial access was difficult as the scene of the crash was down in the cutting. First responders were unable to safely reach the train, and they had to wait until ladders and ramps arrived. Once down, there was precious little that anyone could do to free the trapped survivors. The massive slab of roadway which had crushed the train had fallen more or less in one section, and it would be impossible to move without a very big crane. The electrical wires which spanned the tracks had to be cut and pulled away to allow temporary stairways to be erected. Even when firemen arrived with cutting gear, they were reluctant to use it as the carriages carried LPG canisters for winter heating. Some of these canisters had ruptured, and the smell of the flammable gas permeated the harrowing scene. To add to the already complicated rescue effort, as news of the disaster spread, crowds of curious onlookers arrived, blocking the roads around the crash site and getting in the way of the emergency vehicles which were trying to ferry people to nearby hospitals. Some 250 policemen were eventually deployed just to control the crowd, which by mid-morning had numbered around 5,000 ghoulish sightseers. The rescue effort crawled along, and it was painfully slow going. The heat of the day was stifling, and the fire brigade had to spray water onto the crash site to try and cool down the baking concrete slabs. And these giant slabs of concrete, they kept on shifting and settling. One policeman was nearly crushed as he attempted to reach a trapped survivor, and two other firemen were temporarily trapped themselves under the edge of the slab when it suddenly fell down a further 15 centimetres. Rescue workers milled around on the tracks, waiting anxiously for the moment when they were able to help. At the appearance of a lone survivor being extracted from the wreckage, they ran forwards, leading to almost farcical scenes of up to 30 rescue workers jostling to carry a single stretcher. For those trapped deep within the wreckage yet somehow still alive, it would be hours before they would be freed, and sadly for many this was to be a short-lived respite. First responders were shocked when, after hours of cutting and digging out the trapped victims, these poor souls suddenly died after being freed from the tangled wreckage. This was a result of what's known as bywater syndrome or crush syndrome. In these cases, the victim, pinned beneath a heavy object, has suffered large amounts of tissue damage. Within this compressed, damaged muscle tissue, toxic amounts of myoglobin and potassium can accumulate, but it doesn't affect the victim as long as the crushing weight of whatever they are trapped under acts like a tourniquet and keeps the deadly toxins away from the organs. While ever the victim is pinned under pressure, they're still alive, but once the pressure is released and the victim is freed, the toxins circulate and quickly overwhelm the organs. It's usually the kidneys that fail and the victim dies, sometimes within seconds of being freed. At the time, this phenomenon wasn't widely understood, and the rescue workers, obviously eager to recover as many trapped passengers as possible, unwittingly sped some of them to their demise. It took over 30 hours to clear the crushed train of all survivors and bodies. A crane capable of lifting portions of the slab had been found, and eventually the flattened train was revealed. Reporter Malcolm Brown, who was there, stated that police and rescue officials watching reeled back in unison as the crushed bodies came into view. The final death toll of 84 made the Granville disaster by far and away Australia's deadliest rail accident. There were over 200 people injured, but fortunately most of these injuries were mild. Many in the rearmost carriages suffered no injuries whatsoever, and they were able to climb down from the train unaided and get on with the rest of their day. When trying to understand the root cause of the crash, attention first turned to the driver, Ted Ullenschwitz, but it became apparent that he wasn't to blame. He hadn't been speeding, and going too fast was not the reason for the derailment. When investigators checked the track, they found the cause. It hadn't been secured correctly, and none of the maintenance crews had spotted this shoddy work. The improperly fastened rails had spread out over time, which allowed the front wheel of the engine to slip off the track. The front wheel flanges of the train were also found to be very worn and should have been replaced. Now, this had been apparently spotted some 6 months earlier, but nothing had been done. It also came to light that there had already been 2 derailments on that same stretch of track, and at least in one of these derailments, one involving a freight train, cars had come off the track and struck the bridge supports. The inquiry painted a picture of neglect and shoddy maintenance that plagued the entire New South Wales rail system, with blame for this state of affairs reaching the highest levels of management. Nonetheless, no criminal charges were filed and nobody was held accountable. In the months following the Granville disaster, the Australian government promised a $200 million overhaul of the entire rail network. Today, there is a memorial garden to the victims of the crash located close to the scene of the accident. Tragedies involving great loss of life are almost always thoroughly investigated and documented in order that the same tragedy is not needlessly repeated. However, this is not always the case. In today's story, I'll look at an incident that has a shockingly high death toll, and yet even some of the basic facts surrounding this tragedy seem to be in doubt. It's India's worst rail accident, the Bihar derailment disaster. Back when I was a young man with few possessions and even fewer responsibilities, I embarked upon a round-the-world trip with my wife. Part of this trip included 7 months spent travelling around India, travelling mostly by bus and train. Now, I admit I hated travelling on the buses, but I loved travelling by train. In India, you can get almost anywhere by train, and they're a great way to meet people. The Indian rail network is extensive, and hundreds of trains carry literally millions of passengers each day. The cost of a train ticket is fairly cheap. Well, I say cheap, it seemed cheap to me, but as with many things in life, it's all relative. A ticket costing the equivalent of €20 for a 2-day train ride is a bargain for me, yet for the poorest section of Indian society, it's completely unaffordable. As a result, many people opt to travel for free, sitting on the carriage roofs and clinging to the sides of trains, leading to situations of the trains being hopelessly overcrowded. And when disaster strikes, it does so with a magnitude which is almost unheard of in comparison to rail accidents from other parts of the world. India's deadliest rail accident, and possibly one of the deadliest rail accidents of all time, occurred on June 6, 1981. The 9-car passenger train, the 416 Downline as it was known, was running between Mansi and Saharsa in India's northern Bihar state. The train was fully booked. It was carrying 4 wedding parties, but, as usual, it was filled beyond capacity and was overloaded with hundreds of extra ticketless passengers. The low estimate puts the number on board at around 800, and at the upper end it's possible that around 1,200 people may have been on board. The weather that day was appalling, with continuous heavy rain due to a tropical cyclone. This rainfall had swollen the rivers, muddied the roads, and caused disruption and delay across the whole of Bihar state. For an accident of this magnitude that occurred relatively recently, there is a lot of speculation, but very little in the way of hard fact. What little we do know for sure is as follows. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on the 6th of June 1981, the 416 down line crossed the bridge which spanned the Bagmati River. At this point, for reasons which remain unclear, the train derailed, and 7 of the 9 carriages plunged into the swollen river. With water levels being much higher than normal, the carriages were completely submerged. Those who were riding on the roof, or who were somehow able to escape from the submerged cars, were simply swept away by the rushing water. Rescue teams were hours away from the scene of the disaster, and the survivors, those who were lucky enough to be in the rear 2 carriages, could do nothing but remain in place and wait for the authorities to respond. By the time the authorities were able to get to the scene, it was clear that this would be a recovery operation and not a rescue. Over the following days, thousands of relatives joined rescue workers on the riverbanks, sobbing and wailing for missing family members. Nets were spread out across the river to try and catch bodies swept downstream by the current, and loudspeakers announced a reward of $3 for each body that was recovered by the villagers, although many of them were unwilling to help due to the Indian caste system, where only members of a certain caste are supposed to handle human remains. The scant details of the story belie what must have been harrowing scenes. Eyewitness reports include macabre details of the recovery operations, things like seeing dozens of bodies tumbling out of the carriages as the giant crane hoisted them out of the water, and of relatives combing the riverbanks, and actually finding the remains of their family members washed up in the mud. The army was present to control the crowds and to gather what little information was available, and a tethered frogman was sent into the murky waters to look for remains. Over the course of several days, a reported 212 bodies were recovered, and although initial estimates had varied from 800 to 2,000, a week later, the Indian government announced an official death toll of 235, with 88 survivors. And, almost unbelievably, that's about all we know for sure. Reports as to why the train derailed differ wildly. Initial official reports stated that the train had literally been blown off the bridge by the cyclone, but this seemed very unlikely as nearby huts and haystacks were still standing. Another report, backed up by a few eyewitnesses, stated that the driver caused the accident by slamming on the brakes too hard to try and avoid hitting a cow or water buffalo that had wandered onto the railway line. Yet another theory was that a flash flood had wiped out some of the bridge supports and the bridge collapsed as the train crossed. But even this basic hypothesis seemed unverifiable. For example, one report stated that the bridge had collapsed, whilst another report stated that the bridge remained completely intact and was in use. Again, one report stated 7 carriages went into the river, another lists just 6, with one carriage apparently tumbling down the riverbank, disintegrating as it went. Trying to find any details that tally in this story proves difficult. The surviving engineer and the conductor of the train apparently fled the scene, fearing for their lives, and a newspaper report from a few days later stated that the conductor had been found by the villagers and was subsequently lynched. Again, lots of hearsay, but very little which can be confirmed or denied. The railway minister at the time, Kedar Panda, summed up the Bihar disaster as a God-sent tragedy, and that was that. Case closed. The one thing about this tragedy that is almost certainly without dispute is that many more people perished than the official figure of 235. An actual figure for the number of fatalities in the Bihar derailment is impossible to determine, but most informed observers agree that at least 800 people died, with the possibility that the actual death toll could be well above 1,000 victims. Now that figure would rank the Bihar rail disaster as one of the deadliest of all time, comparable to the Saint-Michel de Maurienne derailment and the Sirua disaster, both of which occurred during World War I. So, the Bihar derailment is almost certainly the worst peacetime rail disaster ever recorded, and yet we still know hardly anything about it. To this day, there's no official cause listed, and the whole tragic event remains shrouded in doubt and confusion. Hundreds of victims simply vanished that day, swept away, and their bodies were never found. They were never recovered. As far as I know, there isn't even a memorial to mark the tragedy. And with India suffering many, many more tragic rail accidents in the years since Bihar, it seems that today the victims of this tragedy are pretty much all but forgotten.